A retired police dog, haunted by a mysterious past, finds a new home with an elderly man on an isolated farm. But when danger approaches, he proves his mission is far from over. The afternoon sun illuminated the rusty gate of the farmhouse as Sergeant Thompson parked his patrol car. Anthony watched from the window, his hands firmly gripping the wheels of his chair, anxious about the arrival of the new resident. It had been 3 months since Margaret, his wife, had passed away, leaving behind only memories and a deafening silence in that house with yellowed walls in Springfield. "I brought him, Anthony," Thompson announced, opening the back door of the car. A majestic German shepherd leaped out, his posture revealing years of training. His black fur with yellow patches gleamed under the Colorado sun, and his alert eyes were already scanning every inch of the property. "This is Max," Thompson introduced, holding the dog's leash. "He was one of the best dogs we ever had in the force. He retired recently, but he still has a lot of energy and loyalty to give." Anthony adjusted his glasses, studying the animal that would now be his companion. He had initially resisted Thompson's idea of adopting a retired police dog, but the loneliness and recent rumors of incidents in the area made him reconsider. "He seems so serious," Anthony remarked, noticing how the dog maintained a vigilant stance, his ears constantly moving. Thompson smiled, approaching with Max. "It's the training, but you'll see beneath that tough exterior is a big heart. You just need to earn his trust." The sergeant spent the next few hours explaining Max's routine: feeding times, necessary exercises, basic commands. Anthony listened attentively, mentally noting every detail. He observed how the dog, even during the explanations, remained alert, reacting to the slightest noise coming from the woods surrounding the property. "One last thing," Thompson added before leaving. "Max has a special instinct. If he gets agitated about something or someone, pay attention. He's rarely wrong." That first night, Anthony discovered that adapting to a new companion would be more challenging than he had imagined. Max refused to sleep in the corner prepared in the living room, preferring to stand guard near the back door. Several times, Anthony woke up to the dog patrolling the house, his paws silent on the wooden floor. The next morning, as Anthony sipped his coffee on the porch, he noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The silence that once weighed heavily over the farmhouse had been replaced by a watchful, protective presence. Max alternated between lying at the foot of his chair and making small patrols around the yard, always returning to check on his new owner. A routine began to establish itself naturally. Anthony discovered that Max loved listening to stories, or at least pretended very well, keeping his eyes fixed on him as he recounted memories from his youth. The dog also proved to be extraordinarily gentle with Anthony's limitations, adjusting his pace during their walks around the yard and leaning against the wheelchair when the elderly man needed help balancing. A week passed, and Anthony could no longer imagine the house without Max. However, he began to notice small details that intrigued him. The dog had his own routine of vigilance, especially intensified at night. At certain moments, his ears would perk up and his body would tense, as if he sensed something that human senses couldn't perceive. On a particularly hot afternoon, while watering his plants, Anthony watched Max run toward the gate, barking differently than usual. It was a deeper, more urgent sound. As he approached, he saw only a shadow disappearing around the bend of the dirt road. Max remained on alert. For hours, his eyes fixed on the direction where the shadow had vanished. It must be some wild animal, Anthony tried to convince himself. But something in Max's behavior suggested there was more to the story than simple canine curiosity. That night, settled in his room, Anthony reflected on Thompson's words. Max has a special instinct. As sleep slowly came, he could hear the dog's paws in the hallway, his faithful guardian on constant watch. What Anthony didn't yet know was that this vigilance would be more necessary than he could imagine. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching from, and stay tuned. The morning began with a troubling discovery. As Anthony went out for his morning routine of watering the plants, he noticed something different on the ground near the gate. Footprints in the damp soil formed a trail leading from the gate to the back of the property. Max was already there, sniffing intensely at each mark left in the dirt. "How strange," Anthony murmured, wheeling his chair closer to the spot. The footprints were clearly human and seemed recent. As he examined the marks, Max remained on high alert, a low, continuous growl in his throat. That morning, John, the young neighbor who often helped with the heavier chores around the farmhouse, arrived to trim the trees in the yard. Anthony noticed something different in Max's behavior. The dog, usually friendly with frequent visitors, kept a calculated distance from the young man, his eyes attentive to every movement. "Your new dog doesn't seem to like me much," John commented, trying to sound casual as he put away the tools in the shed. "He's still adjusting," Anthony replied, observing how Max strategically positioned himself between him and the young man. But deep down, he remembered Thompson's warning about the animal's instincts. That afternoon, Anthony received a visit from a man who introduced himself as a cleaning products salesman. As soon as the stranger began his sales pitch, Max assumed a posture Anthony had never seen before. The fur on his neck bristled, and a deep growl emanated from his throat. The salesman, visibly disturbed, hurried to say goodbye, almost tripping as he left through the gate. That night brought a change to the established routine. Instead of making his usual rounds, Max remained fixed at the living room window, his eyes locked on something beyond the darkness of the backyard. Occasionally, his ears twitched, picking up sounds Anthony couldn't perceive. Around 2 in the morning, Anthony was awakened by Max's barking, not the usual alert barks, but a more urgent, more intense sound. When he arrived in the living room in his wheelchair, he found the dog in a state of extreme agitation, alternating between barks and growls, always focused in the direction of the woods. "What is it, buddy?" Anthony whispered, feeling a shiver run down his spine. The answer came in the form of a distant sound of branches breaking, followed by the unmistakable noise of hurried footsteps. The next morning, during his inspection of the backyard, Anthony found something that made his heart race. A folded piece of paper, caught on the farm gate, swaying in the morning breeze. With trembling hands, he picked up the note. The message was short, but enough to make his blood run cold. "Be careful who you trust." Immediately, Anthony grabbed the phone to call Sergeant Thompson. As he waited, he watched Max, who continued his tireless vigil, now even more intense. The dog's behavior, which had once seemed merely peculiar, was beginning to take on a disturbing meaning. Thompson arrived in less than half an hour, his expression serious as he examined the note. Anthony noticed how Max approached the sergeant, as if trying to communicate something only the two of them understood. "Anthony," Thompson began hesitantly, "there's something I need to tell you about Max, something I didn't mention before because I didn't want to worry you." He paused, looking at the dog that was now sniffing around the perimeter of the gate. Before retiring, Max was involved in important operations that made him a target. Anthony felt the weight of those words, the marks on the ground, the dog's behavior around certain people, the nighttime sounds. Everything was starting to form a disturbing puzzle. His peaceful refuge in Springfield now seemed filled with shadows and secrets. "What exactly are you telling me, Thompson?" Anthony asked, his voice barely masking his concern. The sergeant took a deep breath, preparing to reveal a story that would completely change Anthony's perspective on his new companion. A story that would explain why Max wasn't just a retired dog, but a key player in a much larger and more dangerous game than anyone could imagine. Thompson led Anthony to the porch, while Max maintained his constant vigilance around the property. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, creating a fitting backdrop for the conversation about to take place. "Before retiring," Thompson began, adjusting his posture in the chair, "Max was part of an operation that changed the security landscape across the entire region. He was crucial in locating a group that operated in several towns in southern Colorado, including Springfield." Anthony felt a knot in his stomach. Thompson's words seemed to carry a much deeper meaning than they appeared. "What kind of group?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "A group specialized in mapping out isolated properties," Thompson explained, lowering his voice. "They studied the routines of residents, especially the elderly and those living alone. Max has a special talent for identifying certain signatures, scents, behaviors, patterns that ordinary people wouldn't notice. The elderly man looked at his canine companion, who at that moment was standing near the gate, his ears constantly twitching. "Is that why he acts differently around some people?" Thompson nodded. "We managed to dismantle much of the group, but their leader, a man known only as the Professor, was never found. Some say he fled to Paraguay. Others believe he's still around, reorganizing his operations." At that moment, Max let out a deep bark, running toward the back of the property. Thompson and Anthony watched the dog disappear behind the shed, returning minutes later with something in his mouth. "What do you have there, boy?" Thompson approached, extending his hand. Max dropped a torn piece of dark fabric. The sergeant examined the material carefully, his face hardening. "This is part of a balaclava, the kind of gear they used to wear." Anthony felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying that they might be interested in my farm?" "It's possible," Thompson replied, weighing his words. The professor had a specific method. He always chose strategic properties, places that could serve as footholds. Your farm, Anthony, is in a perfect location, isolated enough not to draw attention, but with access to multiple escape routes through the woods. The rest of the morning was dedicated to a thorough inspection of the property. Thompson and Max checked every corner, every possible entry point. They found more disturbing evidence: fresh tool marks on the shed's padlock, partially erased footprints near the back, fence and a spot on the fence where the wires seemed to have been tampered with. "I'll increase patrols in the area," Thompson assured before leaving, "and I'll leave some men on standby. But Anthony, Max is your best protection now. He knows these criminals, knows their methods. Trust the signs he gives you." Alone again. With Max, Anthony watched the dog with new eyes. Every movement, every reaction took on a new meaning. When John, the young helper, appeared in the late afternoon to put away the tools, Anthony noticed how Max strategically positioned himself between them, his eyes never leaving the boy. "Everything all right, Mr. Anthony?" John asked, noticing the distant look in the elderly man's eyes. "You seem worried." "Everything's fine," Anthony replied automatically, but his mind was racing. Why did Max always get so tense around the boy? Why, since the dog had arrived, did John seem so interested in knowing about his routine? That night, while organizing some old documents, Anthony came across an old photo of the farmhouse, taken from the top of the hill. In it, he could clearly see how his property connected to several rural roads, some of them long abandoned. Could that be the reason for the interest in his land? A sudden sound in the yard interrupted his thoughts. Max, who had been lying near his chair, jumped up, the fur on his neck bristling. Anthony held his breath, listening. Footsteps? Branches breaking? Or was it just the wind in the trees? Later, in the darkness of his room, Anthony couldn't sleep. Lima's revelations echoed in his mind, mingling with the sound of Max's paws pacing. The hallway, his tireless guardian. What else did that dog know? What secrets were yet to come to light? The night promised to be long, and the mysteries surrounding his quiet farmhouse in Springfield were only beginning to unravel. The morning brought with it a thick fog, typical of winter in Springfield. Anthony watched through the window as Max carried out his morning patrol, his muscular body barely visible through the mist that covered the yard. The coffee cooled on the table, forgotten, as his mind replayed the events of the past few days. It was then that he noticed something different in Max's routine. The dog had stopped abruptly near the shed, his body tense like a guitar string. With a quick movement, he began digging furiously at a specific spot under the wooden structure. "Max, what did you find, buddy?" Anthony called out, maneuvering his wheelchair out of the house. The dog continued its frantic digging, stopping only when its paws hit something solid. With difficulty, Anthony approached the spot. Partially buried, a black backpack emerged from the disturbed earth. Max stepped back, staying alert as his owner pulled the object from the hole with trembling hands. Inside the backpack, Anthony found equipment that made his heart race. Communication radios, a detailed map of the region with coded notes, and a tactical knife. Everything seemed new, recently hidden there. "My God," he whispered, realizing the gravity of the situation. His hands shook as he grabbed the phone to call Thompson. That's when he heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the front path. "Good morning, Mr. Anthony." John's voice sounded too cheerful, almost artificial. The young man carried his usual tools, but something in his eyes seemed different. "I came early today, need to finish that job at the back of the property." Max immediately positioned himself between Anthony and the young man, a low growl in his throat. Anthony noticed the backpack was still visible beside his wheelchair. "John," he tried to keep his voice steady, "today isn't going to work. I'm expecting a visitor." The young man hesitated, his eyes shifting between the unearthed backpack and Anthony's tense face. For a moment, a shadow crossed his cheerful expression. "Of course, no problem," he replied, slowly backing away. "I'll come back another day." Before leaving, he cast one last glance at the backpack, something that didn't go unnoticed by Max, who intensified his growl. As soon as John disappeared into the mist, Anthony quickly dialed Thompson. The sergeant arrived in record time, accompanied by 2 police officers. While examining the contents of the backpack, Thompson explained that the equipment was consistent with what the professor's group used. "This confirms our suspicions," Thompson declared, studying the map they had found. "They're active again. And based on the level of detail on this map, this isn't amateur work." "What about John?" Anthony asked, recalling the young man's reaction. "He seemed disturbed when he saw the backpack." Thompson gestured to one of the officers, who immediately headed toward the patrol car. "We'll check his background. How long has he been working for you?" "About 6 months," Anthony replied, suddenly realizing how that coincided with the period when the first rumors about incidents in the area began to circulate. As the officers worked, Max kept a constant watch, his eyes fixed in the direction John had gone. The dog seemed more agitated than usual, as if sensing that something bigger was about to happen. By afternoon, Thompson returned with troubling information. John wasn't who he claimed to be. His real name was different, and there were records of him passing through police stations in 3 different states. "He's being monitored," Thompson assured. "But Anthony, you need to be even more alert. If they've hidden equipment on your property, it means they have plans for this place." That night, alone with Max, Anthony reflected on how drastically his life had changed. The ranch that had always been his peaceful refuge now felt like a minefield of secrets and dangers. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every nighttime noise carried new meaning. Max, sensing his owner's unease, approached and rested his head on Anthony's knee. His intelligent eyes seemed to say that as long as he was there, nothing bad would happen. Anthony petted the dog's head, finding comfort in his strong, protective presence. The wind whispered through the trees in the woods, carrying with it the promise of a night that would reveal even more secrets. In the thickening darkness, Max kept his guard up, knowing that the real challenges were yet to come. The following week brought an unsettling calm to the ranch. John had not returned since the incident with the backpack, and Sergeant Thompson intensified patrols in the area. Anthony, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was about to happen. During a particularly hot afternoon, while organizing old photographs on the porch, Anthony came across an image that caught his attention. It was an old photo of the region, taken over 2 decades ago, when the ranch still belonged to his parents. In the background of the image, partially visible, was an abandoned structure he had never noticed before. "What is that?" he murmured, to himself, adjusting his glasses. The structure appeared to be some kind of shed or warehouse, located in the densest part of the woods bordering his property. Max, who was lying near Anthony's chair, suddenly perked up his ears. His muscles tensed, and he fixed his gaze in the exact direction where, in the old photo, the mysterious structure stood. "You know something I don't you, buddy?" Anthony asked, observing the dog's reaction. Max responded with a low bark, his body still on high alert. That same night, Anthony received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Clements, his oldest neighbor, appeared visibly agitated. Curiously, Max showed no hostility toward her presence. "Anthony, I need to tell you something," she began, her elderly hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of tea. "Do you remember that old shed deep in the woods, the one that belonged to the old cooperative?" Anthony's heart raced. "The shed in the photo? Do you know something about it?" Last night, I saw strange lights coming from that direction, she continued, lowering her voice. And it wasn't the first time. For weeks now, I've noticed suspicious activity over there, especially in the early hours of the morning. While Mrs. Clements spoke, Max moved closer to the window, his behavior indicating that something had caught his attention. Outside, shadows moved in the darkness of the woods. There's one more thing, the lady added, leaning forward. That young man who worked for you, John. I saw him talking to a strange man near Mr. Joseph's little market. The man wore glasses like a professor, had a distinctive air about him. They seemed to be discussing something important. Anthony felt a shiver run down his spine. A man who looked like a professor. Could it be possible that, before he could process the information, Max began barking furiously, running toward the back of the house? Through the window, Anthony saw beams of light cutting through the darkness of the woods, moving in an organized manner. "Mrs. Clements, give me the phone," he urged. As he dialed Sergeant Thompson, he watched Max, who maintained his protective stance, alternating between growls and alert barks. The sergeant arrived in 15 minutes, accompanied by a tactical team. While the officers combed the wooded area, Thompson examined the old photo Anthony had found. "This shed," Thompson murmured thoughtfully. "It was one of the support points we suspected the professor's group used in the past, but we never got concrete evidence." The search of the woods revealed recent signs of occupation in the abandoned shed, food remnants, tire marks, and, more concerning, detailed plans of several properties in the area, including Anthony's farm. "They're planning something big," Thompson concluded, studying the documents they had found. "And your property, Anthony, seems to be a key piece in the puzzle." That night, after everyone had left, Anthony remained awake, his mind working incessantly. The connections were beginning to form. John, the mysterious man with the professor-like demeanor, the abandoned shed, the lights in the woods. Max kept his tireless vigil, his watchful eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the windows. From time to time his ears twitched, catching sounds only he could hear. In the silence of the early morning, Anthony realized that his quiet life in Springfield had turned into something far more complex and dangerous than he could have imagined. And as he watched his loyal guardian, he was certain that Max knew much more about the whole situation than he let on. The discovery of the abandoned shed brought a new dynamic to the routine of the farm. Thompson had assigned a patrol car to make periodic rounds, and Max seemed even more vigilant, if that was possible. During the day, the dog spent long periods observing the wooded area, as if waiting for something or someone. On a particularly cold morning, Anthony found another note attached to the gate. Unlike the first one, this one contained a more elaborate message. "Not all guardians are trustworthy, some have a price." Next to the words was a crude drawing of a dog. "It's a threat," Thompson concluded, carefully examining the paper after being urgently called. "They're trying to mess with your mind, Anthony. They want you to doubt even Max." But Anthony's trust in his canine companion only grew. That same afternoon, while adjusting the TV antenna, he noticed Max behaving curiously. The dog was systematically digging in different spots in the yard, always in the same places, as if following a pattern. "What are you looking for, buddy?" Anthony asked, approaching in his wheelchair. That's when he noticed something strange. The spots where Max was digging formed a pattern similar to what he had seen on one of the maps found in the shed. With the help of Thompson, who quickly returned after being informed of the discovery, they began to investigate the spots marked by Max. At each point, they found small buried stakes, all numbered. "These are topographic markers," Thompson explained, examining one of the stakes. "Used for mapping land. Someone did a full survey of your property, Anthony, and it looks like it was done quite recently." As they discussed the implications of the discovery, Max began to bark differently. It wasn't his usual alert barks, but something more urgent, more focused. The dog ran between them and a specific spot near the back fence. "He wants to show us something," Anthony realized, following the animal with Thompson. At the spot indicated by Max, partially covered by foliage, they found a small camera skillfully camouflaged. "State-of-the-art technology," Thompson remarked, deactivating the device. Live transmission, long-lasting battery. They were monitoring your every move. The discovery of the camera changed everything. Thompson immediately requested a full sweep of the property, finding 3 more similar devices strategically placed. Each camera had a perfect angle to cover the main access points of the ranch. How did they manage to install all this? Anthony questioned, feeling his privacy violated. John, Thompson replied, his face hardening. He had free access to the property, knew your routine. He must have installed the equipment gradually while working in the garden. That night, as he tried to process all the day's discoveries, Anthony heard a familiar sound, the engine of a motorcycle approaching on the dirt road. It was a sound that had become common in recent months, whenever John came to work. Max immediately went on alert, but his barks were different. There was a tone of recognition, as if he knew exactly who was approaching. "Thompson," Anthony whispered into the phone, "I think our friend decided to pay a nighttime visit." The motorcycle stopped at a safe distance from the ranch. In the dim light, a familiar figure began to approach on foot, clearly trying not to make noise. Max surprisingly didn't bark. Instead, he remained completely silent, his muscles tense like steel cords. What happened in the following minutes would forever be etched in Anthony's memory. The full moon illuminated the backyard like a natural spotlight, turning shadows into actors in a silent theater. And on that improvised stage, a new scene of the mystery was about to unfold, a scene that would definitively change the course of that story. John's figure moved like a shadow in the moonlit yard. Anthony, protected by the darkness of the porch, watched every movement of the young man, while Max maintained his silent and vigilant stance. The sound of the approaching patrol cars was imperceptible, exactly as Thompson had planned. John seemed to be searching for something specific, checking the spots where the cameras had been installed. His expression changed with each discovery of a removed device, revealing a mix of surprise and concern. "Looking for this?" Anthony's voice cut through the night's silence, making John turn abruptly. On the now lit porch, the elderly man held one of the deactivated cameras. "Mr. Anthony," John tried to stay calm, but his trembling voice betrayed him. "I can explain." "Explain what?" Anthony questioned, his voice firm. "How you turned my property into a surveillance post. Or maybe you'd like to explain your conversations with a certain professor." John's face paled at the mention of the professor. At that moment, Max began to move, circling the young man in a calculated perimeter. There was no aggression in his movements, only a tactical precision that revealed years of training. "You don't understand." John took a step toward the porch but stopped when he heard Max's low growl. "We didn't mean to harm anyone. Your property is just strategic." "Strategic for what?" A new voice joined the conversation. Sergeant Thompson emerged from the shadows, accompanied by 2 officers. "To serve as a base for your operations in the area?" John looked around, realizing he was surrounded. His eyes frantically searched for an escape route, but Max and the officers had closed off all possible angles. "He's going to sacrifice me," John murmured, more to himself than to the others. "The professor doesn't tolerate mistakes. We can protect you." Thompson stepped closer, his hands extended in a gesture of peace. "But we need to know everything. Where is he? What's the plan?" The young man seemed to be battling an internal conflict. His eyes darted between those present, finally landing on Max, who watched him with a disturbing intensity. "The warehouse," John began, his voice barely a whisper. "It was just the beginning. He has plans for the entire region. Maps, documents, everything is—" A sudden noise from the woods interrupted him. Max immediately turned toward the sound, his body tense like a spring ready to snap. "He's here." John paled even further. "He's always nearby, watching." Thompson quickly directed his men to check the woods while guiding John to a safer location. Anthony, from his position on the porch, watched the scene unfold like a suspenseful movie. Max, however, kept his attention divided between John and the woods. Something in the dog's behavior suggested he perceived more layers to the situation than the humans could comprehend. "Anthony!" Thompson called, his voice urgent. "I need you and Max to come inside, now!" But before they could move, a sequence of events began to unfold. Light started flickering in the woods like a silent code. John, seeing the signals, made a sudden move. but Max was faster, blocking his path without any aggression. "It's too late," John said, his voice trembling. "The plan is already in motion, and you have no idea what's coming." Thompson signaled for his men to take John away, while others continued the search in the woods. Anthony, watching everything from the porch, felt that this night had permanently altered the course of events. Max returned to his owner's side, but his eyes remained fixed on the darkness of the woods. The dog seemed to know that this was only the beginning, that the revelations of that night were just the tip of a much larger mystery. In the silence that followed as the patrol cars drove away with John, Anthony reflected on how his quiet life in Springfield had turned into a complex puzzle. And looking at Max, he was certain that his loyal guardian would be key to uncovering the missing pieces of this story. The night after John's arrest was long and restless. Thompson had left 2 officers to guard the property, but it was Max who truly maintained the tireless watch. The dog alternated between patrolling the boundaries of the land and returning to check on his owner, as if performing a precisely choreographed routine. Anthony couldn't sleep. In his mind, he replayed every detail of the recent events, every word John had said. "The plan is already in motion," the young man had said. But what plan could that be? Around 3 in the morning, Max began to act differently. It wasn't his usual alert signals, but something more subtle, as if he were trying to communicate something specific. The dog went to the living room shelf, where Anthony kept old property documents. "What is it, buddy?" Anthony asked, wheeling, his chair closer. Max barked softly, his paw lightly scratching the bottom drawer of the shelf. Carefully, Anthony opened the drawer. There were the original deeds to the farm, documents he hadn't seen in years. Among them, he found something he didn't remember storing, an old map of the property dated decades ago. "My God," he whispered, examining the yellowed document. On the paper, beyond the known boundaries of the farm, were markings of old tunnels, reminiscent of the time when the region was known for its mines. Immediately, Anthony called Thompson, who arrived within minutes. As they examined the map under the kitchen light, several pieces began to fall into place. "That explains a lot," Sergeant Thompson murmured, studying the map. "These tunnels, they connect your property not only to the abandoned warehouse, but to several strategic points in the region." Max watched the activity intently, his intelligent eyes fixed on the map, as if he understood exactly what was being discussed. "The professor wasn't just interested in my ranch," Anthony concluded, feeling a chill. "He wanted the tunnels." "Exactly," Thompson agreed. "With this tunnel system, they would have secret routes throughout the region, perfect for—" His words were interrupted by an urgent bark from Max. The dog ran to the kitchen window, his tense body signaling imminent danger. Through the glass, they saw a sudden flash coming from the direction of the abandoned warehouse, followed by sounds of movement in the woods. Thompson immediately called for reinforcements over the radio, while Max kept his eyes fixed on the darkness, as if he could see beyond it. "They're trying to clean up the evidence," Thompson concluded. "John must have revealed more than he should have during the interrogation." The next few minutes were filled with absolute tension. Patrol cars arrived silently, positioning themselves strategically around the property. Max, however, seemed more interested in a specific spot in the backyard, near where he had found the buried backpack days earlier. Following the dog's instinct, Thompson and other officers investigated the area. Under the light of flashlights, they discovered something disturbing. A camouflaged entrance recently cleared, leading directly to the old tunnels. "They weren't just watching," Thompson said, his voice heavy with concern. "They were reactivating the entire tunnel system, and now—" A new sound caught everyone's attention. Max had positioned himself in front of the tunnel entrance, his behavior indicating that something or someone was approaching from underground. "Fall back," Thompson ordered, pulling Anthony away from the area. Max, however, held his ground, his eyes fixed on the dark entrance of the tunnel. The sound of footsteps echoed ever closer, reverberating through the underground passage. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, a tall man with glasses carrying a briefcase. Upon seeing the police officers, he tried to retreat back into the tunnel, but Max had already blocked his escape route. "Professor," Thompson said, his voice steady. "We finally meet." The man adjusted his glasses, his face maintaining an unsettling calm. "Sergeant Thompson," he replied, as if engaged in casual conversation. "I see you've brought my old friend Max." The dog let out a low growl, recognizing the man's voice. Anthony, watching the scene from his chair, realized he was witnessing the centerpiece of the entire mystery. "The tunnels would have been perfect," the professor continued, his eyes scanning the group. "An entire network beneath the city, connecting strategic points, years of planning." "Years wasted," Thompson interrupted, as two officers moved in to make the arrest. "It's over, Professor." As he was led to the patrol car, the professor cast one last glance at Max. "You were always special," he murmured. "From the very first day of training, I knew it would be you who found me in the end." Max maintained his dignified stance, watching his old adversary being taken away. Anthony realized that his loyal companion carried more stories and memories than he had ever imagined. In the briefcase seized from the professor, detailed plans were found, not just of the tunnels, but of an entire operation that would span several cities in the region. Springfield was only the beginning. "Your farm," Thompson explained to Anthony, "was the central point of it all, the perfect location to coordinate operations through the tunnels, and Max knew from the start," Anthony finished, stroking the dog's head. "That's why the professor never attempted a direct approach. The early morning was already giving way to the first rays of sunlight when the last vehicles left the property." Anthony, exhausted but relieved, watched Max make his morning rounds, as if that extraordinary night had been just another day in his mission of protection. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching us from, and stay tuned. The days following the professor's capture brought a new routine to the ranch. Specialized teams worked on documenting and sealing the ancient tunnels, turning each underground passage into history. Max observed the entire process with interest, as if personally overseeing the closure of that chapter of his life. Anthony, in turn, was discovering more and more about his loyal companion's past. Thompson brought records of the operations Max had participated in, revealing an extraordinary career dedicated to protection and service. He was crucial in over 50 operations, Thompson explained, showing old photographs. But the case of the professor, that one was always special. Max was the only one who managed to track his patterns, understand his movements. On a quiet afternoon, while watching the sunset from the porch, Anthony received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Clements arrived carrying an old photo album. "I found something you need to see," she said, carefully opening the album. "These are photos of my late husband from the time he worked at the old cooperative." The images revealed the history of the tunnels, originally built for transporting minerals. They had been expanded over the years, creating a true underground web beneath the region. "My husband always said these tunnels held secrets," Mrs. Clements continued. "He would be happy to know they helped capture criminals, even after so much time." Max, who had been lying near Anthony's chair, suddenly stood up, his ears alert. A car was approaching on the dirt road. It was Thompson, bringing news from the investigation. "The professor has started talking," the sergeant announced, sitting down with them on the porch. "The operation was bigger than we imagined. There were connections in 3 states, all centered here in Springfield." As Thompson shared the details, Anthony watched Max. The dog maintained its attentive posture, but there was a different serenity in its eyes, as if it knew its most important mission had been fulfilled. "You know," Anthony began, his voice choked with emotion, "when you brought Max, Thompson, I thought I was just getting a retired dog. I never imagined that you were getting a hero," Thompson finished, smiling. "Max has always been exceptional, but here with you, he found something beyond duty. He found a home." Mrs. Clements, who had been listening quietly, added, "It's like my grandmother always said, God puts angels in our path, sometimes with 4 legs." The late afternoon brought a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of flowers from the garden. Max was making his usual patrol around the yard, but now his movements were lighter, more relaxed. The weight of constant vigilance had been replaced by the simple joy of protecting those he loved. The farm will never be the same, Anthony reflected, watching his companion. But maybe that's the beauty of life, how it can surprise us when we least expect it. Thompson said his goodbyes at dusk, promising to return the next day with more updates on the case. Mrs. Clements also left, handing Anthony the photo album. "For you to keep a piece of this story," she said. Alone with Max, Anthony contemplated how his life had changed in the past few weeks. The loneliness that once consumed him had given way to a deep sense of purpose and connection. In Max, he had found not just a guardian, but a friend who understood him beyond words. The dog approached, resting its head on its owner's lap. Its eyes, always alert, now conveyed a profound peace. Together, they watched the first stars appear in the Springfield sky, knowing that some bonds are forged not by fate, but by a unique combination of courage, loyalty, and love. The arrival of spring brought new colors to Anthony's farm. The garden, now more vibrant, received special care from Mr. Joseph, an experienced man Thompson had recommended to replace John. Max immediately accepted the new gardener, displaying that calmness he only showed around trustworthy people. One particularly pleasant morning, as Mr. Joseph pruned the rose bushes, an envelope was delivered to the farm. It was a letter from John, written from the rehabilitation center where he was serving his sentence. "Dear Mr. Anthony," the letter began, "I write to ask for your forgiveness and also to warn you. There are things about the professor that have yet to come to light. He kept a detailed journal of his operations, hidden somewhere on the property. Max knows where it is. He always has." Anthony looked at his loyal companion, who at that moment was intently watching a bird in the garden. How could a dog know the location of a journal? "Thompson needs to see this," Anthony murmured, reaching for the phone. "Sergeant." Thompson arrived in less than an hour, accompanied by a police officer carrying special equipment. "This is Officer Marina," Thompson introduced. "She worked with Max on his last operations before retirement. She brought something that might help us." Marina pulled an object from the case that looked like an old toy, a small red ball that made Max's eyes light up in recognition. "This was the marker we used in specific training sessions," she explained. "Max was conditioned to search for important objects using this marker as a reference." Carefully, Marina activated a small device inside the ball, which began emitting a nearly imperceptible sound signal to human ears. Max immediately assumed his working posture, the one Anthony had seen only a few times before. The dog began a methodical search of the property, his nose close to the ground, following a pattern. Only he understood. After 20 minutes of searching, he stopped near an old tree at the edge of the property. "There," Marina pointed, "he's signaling." With the help of Mr. Joseph, who was familiar with the behavior of old roots, they began carefully digging around the tree. At half a meter deep, they found a hermetically sealed metal box. Inside it, along with the journal mentioned by John, were photographs, documents, and to everyone's surprise, an old police medal. This medal Thompson held, the object with reverence. It was Sergeant Mendez, Max's first trainer. He disappeared 5 years ago during an operation. Max approached, his snout gently touching the medal. There was something in his eyes, a mix of recognition and sadness that made Anthony's heart tighten. "The professor must have kept this as a trophy," Marina commented, flipping through the journal. "Here, there's an entry about the day Sergeant Mendez disappeared." Thompson took the journal, his eyes scanning the pages. "This changes everything," he murmured. "It wasn't just about the tunnels or escape routes. It was personal. The professor had a particular vendetta against the police, especially against Mendez, who was the first to suspect his activities." Anthony watched Max, who stood in silent vigil near the unearthed box. How many layers of history did that dog carry? How many memories and loyalties were intertwined in his heart? "Now I understand why he was assigned to me," Anthony reflected aloud. "It wasn't just for protection, it was because of the strategic location of your ranch," Thompson finished. "We knew the professor would act again in this area. Max was our best chance of finding him, but something unexpected happened." "What?" Anthony asked, though he already suspected the answer. "You two developed a genuine bond," Marina replied, smiling. You turned a tactical mission into something much more meaningful. As the team collected the evidence, Max returned to Anthony's side, resting his head on his lap. The elderly man stroked the dog's ears, realizing that each discovery, instead of unraveling the mystery surrounding his companion, only added new dimensions to his extraordinary story. The contents of the professor's diary turned out to be more impactful than anyone could have imagined. In the weeks following the discovery, a special task force was assembled to investigate every detail of the notes. Thompson made frequent visits to the ranch, always bringing new information about the case. The connections go far beyond what we imagined, the sergeant explained during one of these visits. The professor had created a complex network of informants across various institutions, people who seemed above any suspicion. Anthony, who followed the revelations with growing interest, noticed subtle changes in Max's behavior. The dog seemed more relaxed, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "It's like he knows his mission has been accomplished," Anthony commented to Thompson, watching Max play with a butterfly in the garden, something he had never done before. "It's more than that," Thompson smiled. "Max has always been exceptional at his job, but here with you he found something that training couldn't give him. A purpose beyond duty." The news of the diary's discovery brought unexpected activity to the quiet town of Springfield. Journalists tried to interview Anthony, curious about his involvement in the professor's capture. But it was a particular visit that changed the course of events. Clara Mendez, the daughter of the missing sergeant, came in person to express her gratitude. When she saw her father's medal, her eyes filled with tears. "Dad always said Max was special," she remarked, gently petting the dog, who greeted her with surprising gentleness. He could see beyond appearances, understand people in a unique way. During her visit, Clara shared stories from the time when Max was training with her father. Old photographs showed a younger dog, but with the same attentive and intelligent gaze. After he was gone, Clara hesitated. Max changed. He remained efficient, but something in his eyes, and it was like he carried a silent grief. Anthony understood perfectly. He too knew the pain of loss, the void left by a loved one. Perhaps that was why he and Max had connected so deeply. They both understood the value of a fresh start. Clara's visit inspired an idea. With the help of Sergeant Thompson and Marina, Anthony began transforming part of his ranch into a training center for service dogs, a place where Max's experience could be shared with a new generation of guardians. "He'll be an excellent instructor," Marina observed, watching how Max interacted with a German Shepherd puppy during an evaluation visit. "He has a natural instinct for teaching." The project gained immediate support from the community. Veterinarians volunteered to provide support, neighbors donated materials for building the kennels, and even John, in his letters from the rehabilitation center, offered suggestions based on his experience with construction. Sometimes, Anthony reflected one afternoon as he watched the construction of the training center, we need to go through storms to find our true north. Max, lying at the foot of his chair, looked up as if he understood perfectly. His gaze, once always divided between duty and vigilance, now conveyed a deep sense of peace. The ranch, which had once been just a lonely refuge, was becoming a place of renewal and hope. The underground tunnels, once tools for dark plans, would be sealed and replaced with new foundations, this time for a noble purpose. "You know," Sergeant Thompson remarked, watching a group of volunteers work on the construction, "when I brought Max here, I was sure it would be good for both of you. But this exceeds any expectation." Anthony smiled, reaching out to stroke his loyal companion. In Max, he had found not just a guardian, but a life teacher. Each day brought a new lesson about courage, loyalty, and the ability to turn scars into strength. The training center was beginning to take shape on Anthony's ranch. What was once just a project on paper was now materializing into solid structures and specially prepared areas for dog training. The transformation wasn't just physical, there was a new energy in the air. One special morning, the ranch received a visit that would further change the course of this story. Colonel Roberts, the former commander of the K9 unit where Max began, his career arrived with a surprise. "We found this in the old archives," he said, handing Anthony a folder yellowed with time. "It's the complete record of Max's training, including personal notes from Sergeant Mendez." As Anthony flipped through the documents, Max approached, his nose sniffing the pages with interest. It was as if he recognized the scent of his past. "Incredible," murmured Anthony, reading the notes. "It says here that Max demonstrated unique abilities from a young age. He was able to detect patterns that other dogs didn't notice." Colonel Roberts smiled, watching Max with admiration. He was always exceptional, but there was something beyond training, a kind of natural wisdom. Mendez used to say that Max didn't just follow orders, he understood the purpose behind them. The pages revealed fascinating details, records of successful operations, special techniques developed specifically to leverage Max's unique abilities, and observations about his extraordinary behavior. "Look at this," the colonel pointed to a specific note. 3 months before his disappearance, Mendez wrote about suspicions of infiltration in the unit. Max had started acting differently around certain officers. Thompson, who had arrived during the conversation, picked up the folder with interest. "This confirms our theory. The professor had contacts within the corporation. Max must have sensed something wrong long before anyone else." As the three men discussed the revelations, Max kept a silent vigil near the window. His gaze alternated between the group and the horizon, as if connecting past and present in his canine mind. "There's one more thing," the colonel added, pulling a flash drive from his pocket. "We found old recordings of the training sessions. I believe they could be useful for the center." The footage showed a younger Max, working in perfect sync with Mendez. The dog's dedication and intelligence were evident in every exercise, in every simulated mission. "That's why I came personally," the colonel explained. "It's not just about documents and recordings. I want to offer official support to the training center. The corporation recognizes the importance of the work you're starting here." Anthony felt the weight of that offer. Official support would mean more resources, more structure, and more possibilities to help other dogs and their future partners. "It would be an honor," he replied, moved, "but on one condition: I want the center to bear Sergeant Mendez's name." The colonel nodded, visibly touched by the suggestion. He would be proud, not just of the center, but especially to see how Max has found his place. At that moment, as if understanding he was being mentioned, Max approached the group. His wise and serene eyes seemed to carry not only the memories of his training, but also the promise of a meaningful future. "It's incredible," Thompson commented, "how everything connects. The farm, the tunnels, the professor. Each piece has brought us to this moment." Anthony watched his companion with renewed respect. Max wasn't just a retired dog or a hero from the past. He was a bridge between two lives, a guardian who was now becoming a mentor. By evening, after the visitors had left, Anthony and Max remained on the porch, contemplating the future that lay ahead of them. The training center would be more than just a place of learning. It would be a tribute to all those who, like Mendez, dedicated their lives to the noble mission of protecting and serving. Spring was in full bloom when the Sergeant Mendez Training Center held its first official event. The farm, now fully adapted, welcomed visitors from across the country. Among them were veteran instructors, retired police officers, and families interested in the guide dog program that would be implemented. Clara, Sergeant Mendez's daughter, was chosen as the godmother of the project. In her inauguration speech, she moved everyone as she spoke about her father's legacy and the continuation of his work through the center. "My father always said that a well-trained dog is not just a tool for work, but a life partner," she declared, her voice choked with emotion. And Max is living proof of that. As if to confirm her words, Max performed a special demonstration with a group of puppies in training. It was impressive to see how he naturally took on the role of instructor, guiding the young dogs with a mix of firmness and patience. "He has a natural gift for teaching," Marina remarked, observing the interaction. "It's as if he's passing on not just techniques, but wisdom." During the event, Anthony received surprising news through Thompson. John, after demonstrating excellent behavior at the rehabilitation center, had been recommended for a social reintegration program. He asked to work here as a volunteer, Thompson explained. He said he wants to contribute to something positive to try to make up for his past mistakes. Anthony looked at Max, who at that moment was guiding a particularly anxious puppy. "What do you think, buddy? Should we give him a second chance?" The dog perked up his ears upon hearing his owner's voice, his intelligent eyes conveying that wisdom which had proven infallible so many times before. "I guess that answers it." Anthony smiled. If Max doesn't object, who am I to deny a chance for a fresh start? The afternoon brought more surprises. A team of researchers from a renowned university expressed interest in studying the special techniques developed by Max and documented in Sergeant Mendez's archives. "It's extraordinary," explained Dr. Beatrice, the team leader. "The pattern recognition method he developed is unique. It could revolutionize service dog training across the country." As the visitors toured the property, Anthony realized how much his ranch had transformed. The flower beds now shared space with training areas. The old garden paths had become exercise trails, and the shed, once a stage for mysteries, now housed modern training equipment. More important than the physical changes was the shift in the energy of the place. What was once a lonely refuge had become a center of renewal and hope, where second chances were possible and new beginnings were celebrated. "Look at that," Thompson remarked, watching a group of children interacting with the dogs in training. "Who would have thought that decision to bring Max here would result in all this?" Anthony smiled, remembering the day he met his loyal companion. Sometimes the best stories start with a simple act of trust. At the end of the day, as the last visitors departed, Max joined Anthony on the porch, as he always did. The sun set on the horizon, painting the sky of Springfield with shades of pink and gold. "You know, buddy," Anthony said softly, "you didn't just change my life. You're changing the lives of many others, too." Max rested his head on his owner's lap, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who had lived many lives in one. From guardian to hero, from protector to mentor, his journey continued to inspire and transform lives. In the peace of that evening, Anthony reflected on how destiny works in mysterious ways. What had begun as a story of loneliness and mistrust had transformed into a narrative of redemption and hope, proving that the strongest bonds are those forged through understanding, forgiveness, and unconditional love. 6 months after the inauguration of the Sergeant Mendez Training Center, the ranch was experiencing its most prosperous moment. The training program had expanded to include not only police dogs, but also guide and therapy dogs. John, now on probation, had become one of the most dedicated employees, overseeing the maintenance of the facilities with a zeal that surprised everyone. On a special morning, Anthony received a long-awaited visitor. The professor, serving part of his sentence in a semi-open regime, had requested a meeting. After much consideration and consultation with Thompson, Anthony decided to receive him. "It's strange to be here again," the professor commented, his eyes scanning the place that was once part of his dark plans. "You've transformed everything. For the better." Max, who initially kept his distance, slowly approached the visitor. There was no longer hostility in his posture, only a serene curiosity. "He was always exceptional," the professor continued, observing the dog. "From the first encounter, I knew he was different. There was something in his eyes, an intelligence that went beyond training." "Why did you want to come here?" Anthony asked directly. "I need to make peace with my past," the professor replied, pulling an envelope from his pocket. "I brought something that belonged to Sergeant Mendez. I found it among my old possessions during one of the therapy sessions in the prison. It was a personal diary, different from the official records. In it, Mendez described his initial suspicions about the professor, and more importantly, his special connection with Max. "He knew," the professor admitted. "He knew I was infiltrating the force long before anyone else. That's why he started training Max differently, developing codes and signals that only the two of them knew." As they talked, a group of young dogs in training played in the field under Marina's supervision. The contrast between the dark past and the vibrant present couldn't have been more evident. "You know," the professor remarked, watching the puppies, "I spent years planning to use this property for shady purposes. Now, I see it has found its true destiny." Thompson, who was discreetly accompanying the visit, approached with a surprising proposal. "Professor, we're developing a rehabilitation program with inmates and abandoned dogs. Your experience with training could be valuable. If you're interested in contributing." The man who once commanded a criminal network seemed genuinely moved by the offer. It would be an honor to give something back to society. Max, who had been following the entire conversation with his usual attentiveness, approached the professor and for the first time allowed himself to be petted. It was as if a silent pact of forgiveness and new beginnings had been sealed. "It's incredible," Anthony reflected, "how life surprises us. Who would have thought that this ranch, once the target of so many conspiracies, would become a place of redemption?" In the afternoon, after the professor's departure, Anthony found Clara organizing the final details for the graduation of the first class of guide dogs. Among the graduates was Thor, a German shepherd who had been rescued from the streets and, under Max's guidance, had transformed into an exceptional assistance dog. "Dad always said that the best guardians are those who know both light and darkness," Clara commented, watching Max guide Thor through his final exercises. "I think I understand now what he meant." The sun was beginning to set when Thompson brought more news. The training center had been selected as a national model for rehabilitation and service dog training programs. "It's official," he announced, showing the document. "Your work will be replicated in other states. Sergeant Mendez' legacy will continue to grow." That night, sitting on the porch with Max by his side, Anthony reflected on how a series of seemingly negative events had turned into something so meaningful. His loyal companion, who had arrived as a guardian on a mission, had become a catalyst for transformations far greater than anyone could have imagined. The big day of the first graduation ceremony at the Sergeant Mendez Training Center dawned with an exceptionally blue sky in Springfield. The farmhouse, now a model of transformation and hope, was decorated for the special ceremony that would mark not only the end of a cycle, but the beginning of many others. Anthony, in his impeccably arranged wheelchair, watched the final preparations with a mix of pride and emotion. Max, as always by his side, maintained that dignified posture that defined him, his graying fur at the temples giving him an even wiser appearance. "Who would have thought, buddy," Anthony murmured, stroking the head of his loyal companion, "that the day Thompson brought you would change so many lives?" The ceremony brought together people from all over the country. Among the attendees were families who would receive the graduating guide dogs, representatives from police institutions, and even some inmates from the rehabilitation program who now worked with the animals. The professor, who was continuing his process of reintegration, was among the speakers. His transformation was remarkable. The man who once used his intelligence for harm now dedicated his knowledge to a noble cause. "True power is not in controlling others," he said in his speech, "but in the ability to transform lives. I learned this by observing an exceptional dog and his even more extraordinary human partner." John, who had helped organize the event, couldn't hold back tears as he watched Thor, the dog he had helped train, being handed over to a young, visually impaired woman. The once frightened stray now carried himself with the same dignity as his mentor, Max. Clara led the special tribute to her father, Sergeant Mendez. A memorial had been erected in the gardens of the center, not just as a remembrance, but as a symbol of a legacy that continued to live on through every animal and person who passed through there. "My father believed that every living being deserves a second chance," she declared, her voice steady despite her emotion. "This center is proof that he was right." Thompson, now promoted to lieutenant, presented a surprise. The government had approved the expansion of the program to 5 more cities, all following the model developed at Anthony's farmhouse. "This place," he said, "taught us that the greatest transformations begin with a simple act of trust. It was that way with Max and Anthony, and it continues to be that way with every new pair formed here." At the end of the ceremony, as the guests dispersed for the cocktail reception, Anthony and Max made their way to their favorite spot on the porch. The afternoon sun bathed the property in a golden light, making the medals on Max's chest, both old and new, shine brightly. "You know, Max," Anthony said softly, "when Thompson brought you, I thought I was just getting a retired dog. Little did I know I was gaining a life teacher. Marina approached with exciting news. A female dog Max had trained had just given birth to a litter of puppies. It was as if the cycle of life and renewal continued, perpetuating the legacy of that extraordinary dog through new generations. In his quiet corner of the porch, Anthony reflected on how his life had completely changed. The loneliness that once consumed him had given way to a deep sense of purpose. His farm, once a solitary refuge, had transformed into a beacon of hope for so many people. Max rested his head on his owner's lap, his wise eyes reflecting the sunset. In that moment of quiet, both knew their lives had become intertwined in a way that transcended the simple relationship between man and dog. They were partners, friends, family. The gentle breeze carried the scent of the garden flowers, mingled with the joyful sounds of puppies playing in the distance. It was a constant reminder that, even in the most unlikely stories, love and loyalty have the power to transform lives and create eternal bonds. Night was beginning to fall in Springfield, but the glow of that special day would remain forever in the memories of all who were part of that extraordinary journey. A journey that began with a retired dog and a lonely old man and turned into a story of redemption, hope, and unconditional love. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching from, and stay tuned.